Okay, so the first research project is about analyzing metabolic complications of obesity. So the actual objective here really is to identify predictors of metabolic complications in obese patients, both in childhood and also in adults. And we propose, or we want to do it from a specific research angle that's being provided by this extreme phenotype approach. Now, just a few words about extreme phenotype. The idea here is really to look at the full distribution of the outcomes, in our case here, metabolic complications, and focus on the extremes of those distributions. So patients who have a very high level or a high value on that distribution, and compared to patients who have a very low value. So you can think about very sick patients to very healthy patients, and really focus on that. The advantage of doing that really is to have a much better opportunity to identify any differences between the two groups, because the two groups are so disparate. An additional advantage is that by its very nature, focusing on such extremes, you're more likely to actually deal with a very homogeneous population in terms of disease picture and so on. Again, that helps in identifying signals, whenever there are signals there, in terms of what are the determinants and so on. And last but not least, by focusing on these extremes, you have more of a chance to perhaps pick up some either simple or sort of oligogenetic determinants. In terms of when you're looking at some genetic determinants, perhaps by looking at those extremes, life is simpler. So that's very clearly the angle that we're going to take in order to address this specific research question. Now, in terms of the deliverables, we're going to start off with a typical epidemiology approach that you start off with describing the population, including the variability of the population in terms of the outcomes that you're looking at, and including identifying those extremes. Second bullet point really is this next step is, once you know and describe the variability, you're going to want to look at determinant what drives this heterogeneity. From a constitutional in terms of gender, age and ethnicity and so on, environmental, in this case, diet, lifestyle and other things, and then perhaps also obesity itself. There may be different types of obesity that may have a bearing on the risk of having the metabolic complications and so on. So once you've got that, and you're going to control for that in order to find out what underlying biological reasons are there for the risk of being in those extremes, in terms of genetic, epigenetic, and metagenomic, and so on. So after you've done all that, you will have patients identified at the extremes, you will have identified them, you will have characterized them according to a risk factor profile, both in terms of obvious factors like lifestyle and so on, but then also in terms of biological and biomarker type of factors. So the next step then really is to focus on these high-risk individuals and really use this battery of risk factors to develop an algorithm for a diagnostic test that really allows organizations in public health, in clinical practice, and then also in pharmaceutical discovery, therapeutics discovery departments, to really focus on those areas to hopefully prevent the progression to these metabolic complications. So the last bullet point really is something that's obviously very much of interest to the pharma industry. By knowing these mechanisms, the hope is that you will get additional ideas about new targets, new druggable targets that sort of can be brought forward to develop therapeutics. So that's really in essence what we're trying to achieve with this approach for obesity. A very brief slide in terms of, again, like Bart, we want to emphasize pediatrics has a very important focus in all this, because we're going to look at obesity in adults, but also obesity in children. So here we want to, in doing all this, we want to really evaluate and find out the specific criteria for overweight and criteria, what drives it, in the same way as we're doing it for the adults, including discovering biomarkers. So in order to keep it the same format, what are the expected sort of contributions that we're looking at for applicant consortia? I mean, the first one is very similar to sort of for the information framework. We are after data. This is all about patient-level data. So we are hoping that there will be organizations being part of this consortium that can actually contribute patient-level health data that are being appropriate and relevant for the specific research question here, including, ideally, access to the patients themselves. So in order to potentially fill any gaps that we might have. Again, the second bullet point is, like before, we expect the applicant consortium to be fully involved in the planning, the design, and the execution of all these studies, and including taking the lead in some of the areas, just the same way as we are doing it from the FPR part. In terms of expertise and capabilities, really, the profile, what we're looking for, and the type of sort of areas that we would like the consortium contain, really, is, again, epidemiology, expertise and capabilities in epidemiology, including molecular epidemiology. Then expertise in clinical practice in obesity and the metabolic area. So clinical practice on one hand, clinical research in that therapy area. Very clearly, given what we want to achieve, expertise in genetics and an extreme phenotype approach, including metabolomics and other omic sciences. Again, because we have a clear focus also on pediatrics, we want the consortium to contain some expertise in pediatrics, including how to study metabolic conditions in children, including design and execution of relevant studies. Again, that goes to sort of, I guess, to some extent together with epidemiology, expertise in the actual analysis of these patient-level observational data. And what are the aspects? As you can imagine, these observational data, we need to really sort of make sure that we take into account of all the different factors that might drive certain results and so on. And then ideally, expertise in developing diagnostic tests, given the risk factor information that we will find from this project. And then also capabilities of doing clinical trials. I have to emphasize here that it's not within the scope of this project to actually conduct clinical trials, but it is really to prepare all the information to actually do clinical trial at a later stage. So it's really more so enabling clinical trials. From our side, again, following the same format, what we can bring to the table is we have expertise in terms of identifying and evaluating patient-level data. A lot of us do that day in, day out, and so on. So we know what we're looking for, what are the different aspects in terms of data quality. Again, we will be very involved in all the planning, the design, and the execution of the different studies, and we will obviously lead certain areas. In terms of expertise and capabilities, again, epidemiology, including molecular epidemiology, statistical methodology. There's a vast amount of expertise in the pharmaceutical industry. We have expertise in the metabolic area. We have expertise in, and bring it to bear here, in genetics and extreme phenotype. The same goes for omic sciences, and we will also provide access to omic technology platforms. The same goes for pediatrics, including studies for pediatric purposes. Management and analysis of patient-level data. Again, a number of us do that on a regular basis. Clinical trials goes without saying. Pharmaceutical companies, they pretty know pretty much know what needs to be done there. And also what we can bring to the table is, in terms of project coordination and management, including building a governance model and so on, we will sort of be involved in that, including communicating and disseminating the results. Okay, so that was very briefly the setup for the obesity project. I'll do now the same, perhaps a little bit quicker, for Alzheimer's disease. The objective is here to identify predictors of the onset of Alzheimer's disease. And number one, the onset of the Alzheimer's disease in the general population. Number two, the onset of Alzheimer's disease in a higher risk population, like the mild cognitive impairment population. And then also the progression of Alzheimer's disease. So really try to identify the risk factors and determinants of all those medical outcomes, again, by using the extreme phenotype approach. The format is very much the same as before with the obesity project. We're going to pick up the population, describe it, describe the variability in terms of the outcomes that we are looking at, including picking or identifying the extremes. We will try to find out what drives these extremes, what drives populations to have high risk or very low risk in terms of constitutional, environmental, and other type of factors. Knowing that, we will control for that in order to find out what is the risk factor profile, or are there any determinants from a biological level in terms of genetics, epigenetics, and metagenomics. Again, we're going to focus then on the identified high-risk population for various different purposes: public health, clinical practice, and then also identifying potential new targets, including developing an algorithm. How can we use this risk factor battery or this risk factor profile to develop an algorithm that allows us to predict and then in clinical practice hopefully prevent the onset of Alzheimer's disease or prevent the progression of Alzheimer's disease. And then at the end, obviously, again, ideally identify new targets for developing therapeutics. So the expected contributions from an applicant consortium is basically the same. I probably, in interest of time, I may probably not go through each one of them, other than to say, obviously, CNS imaging, which wasn't there before. So that's really sort of, in essence, that we want to look at, number one, access to patient. Now, what is perhaps different in Alzheimer's disease patients here, the type of patient we're looking for is actually a specific disease cohort, the disease registries, because it's probably unlikely that routine collected data will contain the necessary detail in order to assess Alzheimer's disease, including having the necessary biomarkers that we're specifically looking for. So in terms of data here, I guess the focus will be very much on actual disease cohorts, disease registries. And then the rest, I guess, is self-explanatory, what we're looking for here. And again, the same is for the FPIA. From our side, what we are bringing to the table, I don't think there's anything new that I haven't said for the obesity project. So I'm going to just move on very quickly. And I think, so again, this is one slide, and that goes for both projects, obesity project and the Alzheimer's disease project. The proposal is to have 7 work packages. First one, start off with and work very closely with the information framework group to really tell them what sort of data do we need, both for obesity and for Alzheimer's disease, and then work with them very closely to evaluate the data and see where the gaps and so on. That's work package 1. Work package 2, again, start off with describing the patient population, including the heterogeneity, the variability, and so on. And then work package 3, focus very much on the extreme phenotypes. work packages 4 describe and characterize the extreme phenotype in terms of their profile, in terms of environmental and other type of determinants, but then very importantly also from a biological in terms of genetics, epigenetics, and so on. So that's really work package 4. So that coming out of work package 4, we have a pretty good idea what is the risk factor profile, specifically in terms of the biological setup for these extremes of the distribution. Work package 5 really is to take these learnings, which have obviously come from the very extremes of the distribution, and try to validate in a general population. Number 1, to see what's the prevalence of these factors in the bigger population. Number 2, do these associations that we found from these very extremes of the distribution, do they still hold in a more general population? And then work package 6 is all about what can we do with these high-risk individuals and perhaps pave the way to conduct a clinical trial in the end, which it has to be emphasized is not within the scope of this project. And work package 7 really is project management and communication. So that really is in essence describes what we want to achieve in terms of work packages for both projects. And the setup has very deliberately been the same, but ultimately it may vary a little bit according to how things are being worked up in a full project. So the last slide really is what's in it for you. I guess I'm repeating messages that came out from other presentations. I mean, the first thing here really is a message to the data providers. What's in it for you? But by participating here it opens you up to a much bigger network of researchers and data users. And you can really sort of realize that data that you own and you manage and so on actually can be part of a much bigger project, a much bigger circle of research and so on. And it really opens up new opportunities for doing collaborative research in a number of areas. The third bullet point really is by being part of such a consortium, you will have access to a number of subject matter experts that will sort of help you in sort of increasing expertise in a number of areas. The fourth one is really by you contributing data to this information framework and to their research efforts, what the idea is really to also get something back in terms of when solutions are being developed here in terms of standards and so on, quite a bit of that information can actually feed back into the local data sources to perhaps improve them in terms of data collection, in terms of how the data are being validated, how data are being managed and so on. So that is very much what we're hoping is also within the scope of this project to actually give something back to the data providers. As a researcher, what's in it for you as a sort of researcher who may have expertise in certain areas to participate here? Well, it's obvious that this will give you access to an unprecedented data, patient-level data pool in order to carry out research that so far will have been either very difficult or impossible to do. And the last bullet point really is here, we're talking about critical mass and effort of this scale. The proposal really is that with a critical mass like such a project, we will be able to carry out research studies that are probably very difficult to do otherwise. So that really concludes our contribution. Leaves me to say thank you, and again to point to, if you have any further questions, please go to the IMI website. It doesn't show up very well here on green, but anyway, you'll have it. So thank you very much.